Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Recovery Talk. In this episode, we are going to talk about OCD and eating disorders. So the aim of this episode is to help you understand the relationship between those conditions. And I'm also going to talk a bit about why an eating disorder is very similar to OCD, to a point where we can maybe even conceptualize it as a form of OCD. And I'm also going to talk a bit about a specific type of OCD that tends to happen in people with eating disorders, and some common OCD-like patterns and behaviors that I often see in clients. So let's get into it. I think to begin with, what is very helpful is just understanding what OCD is and what it isn't. OCD is one of those conditions where there's so much misunderstanding from society about what on earth it even is. People tend to think OCD just means someone who is really, really obsessive with cleaning. That would be like the total layperson's understanding of it. And then people who understand a bit more may understand that it has to do with rituals and compulsions, for example, hand cleaning or needing to touch the doorknob a certain amount of times. But that's just an example of how this disorder may manifest. It can manifest in different ways, which we'll get back to in a bit. To put it very simply, OCD, aka obsessive-compulsive disorder, is a mental health condition characterized by, as the name may suggest, obsessions and compulsions. So typically there would be these obsessive, intrusive thoughts that are only alleviated, or the person feels is only alleviated, by engaging in compulsions. So for example, someone may have this obsessive, intrusive thought about someone breaking into the house because they forgot to lock the door. So they go and check that the door is really locked again and again and again. And in the moment, it gives them a slight sense of relief, but the fact that they keep doing the behavior only reinforces the anxiety, because they are signalizing to their brain that, yeah, you have a good reason to be really concerned about that. So the brain keeps sending anxiety signals, and the person is stuck in a loop. That is, of course, a very simplified version about what's actually going on in the brain in OCD, but it is important to understand that. And this is also where it is similar to an eating disorder, because in eating disorders, there also often are obsessions that feels relieved by compulsions, but then the compulsions end up worsening the obsessions long term. When it comes to both OCD and eating disorders, an crucial part of treatment is exposure therapy and also response prevention. So essentially you get exposed to the thing that scares you and bring up uncomfortable feelings, and you do so without turning to the safety behavior. One important thing to understand about OCD is that it is not OCD unless it is actually harming you. Many people prefer to keep things clean around them, for example, but there's a difference between that and crippling anxiety if you didn't do the extensive cleaning ritual. And another thing to be aware of with OCD is that the more stereotypical presentation of it is not necessarily how everyone with OCD feels and behaves. So when we think about OCD, some may think about cleanliness, for example, hand washing, touching the doorknob. And don't get me wrong, these absolutely are very real and devastating presentations of OCD, but they're just one way it presents. Another form of OCD that is equally as devastating, but far less spoken about, is what we call pure OCD, or pure O. So this stands for primarily obsessive-compulsive disorder. And again, as the name may suggest here, this means that this is a form of OCD that is more about the obsession and less about the compulsion. It's not a set diagnosis, it's more just a very valid presentation of OCD. And even though it's about being more about the obsessions than the compulsions, I would argue that it does also show as compulsions, just more subtly. So this will typically be around mental rumination around a specific fear that you have. And that fear will typically be around a fear of, for example, losing control or harming someone or being a bad person. And these are not just like normal day-to-day reflections. These are ruminations, excessive ruminations that ends up causing so much harm and distress to the person. So some examples of how this may manifest could be someone who has a fear for what if they harm children? What if they want to do inappropriate things towards children? And I want to say that this is not someone who actually has inappropriate thoughts and urges around children. They're just so terrified that they do. And they're not someone who typically would be the person who would be likely to harm a child. Quite the opposite. It is something that goes so against their moral compass and values that they are just terrified about what if. And it's so taboo. I actually saw someone speak about their experiences with that specific type of pure O around the fear of being inappropriate around children, to a point where even them talking about it was enough for them to get backlash, because people were saying, well, if you even think about that, that means that there is something wrong with you and you maybe have those urges, which of course is the last thing that person needed to hear. And it's just not true. Anyone who works with OCD know that that's just not how it works at all. Other ways that this may manifest, again, I'm just throwing out some random examples here, but another one could be a straight person being terrified that they're secretly gay and deceiving their partner, or a gay person being terrified that they are secretly straight and deceiving their partner. And again, many people may have these thoughts at a time. For example, questioning your sexuality is a pretty normal, standard thing that a lot of people do in their life. But what makes it something like pure O is when it's not about just questioning and healthy self-reflection. It is an obsessive, ritualistic behavior that completely ruins your relationship with other people or yourself and your day-to-day functioning. So for example, the person who is having this fear around being inappropriate or harming children may be so scared of going outside and passing like a kindergarten, or even being around family members. And they may just self-loathe themselves and be like, oh yeah, but what if I do have these urges and would do something inappropriate? They may have an incredibly unhealthy relationship with themselves as well, and they just struggle to making friends, because what if friends figure out this bad secret about me that is not even there, right? Or the person who is terrified about their sexuality being different than what they think they are may sabotage their relationships or spend hours and hours online reading signs that I'm gay or signs that I'm straight. Other example of how this behavior may manifest can be around fear that you are secretly losing your mind, fear that you are developing schizophrenia, and then you're researching the ends of the earth of the internet about what are some early symptoms of developing that. You constantly body check, like, oh, wait, was I being a little bit psychotic there? So when it comes to pure O, a more commonly known historical manifestation of the behavior is actually around religion. We tend to call this moral scrupulosity. Scrupulosity? God, I can never say that word. Essentially, moral OCD is often the word used for it. And that is more around going to hell, or breaking a rule, or God watching you, and just being terrified of doing something that goes against your religion. And again, there are plenty of religious people that have concerns around going to hell or not living in alignment with their book of religion. That is okay. Again, it becomes OCD when it is just so all-consuming that it starts to really control your life and cause you significant distress. And another way that I increasingly see it manifesting is around moral scrupulosity around politics, right? Around what if I say something inappropriate or politically incorrect? Again, some degree of that anxiety is normal, especially if you're navigating certain online political spaces. But with moral OCD, it will be completely all-consuming. You're terrified, like you can't engage, you can't be in social environments, you can't go to work. And you spend hours and hours trying to ruminate and rectify this perceived moral damage that you've been doing. So yeah, that is some examples of pure O. And I just wanted to mention that because I don't feel like often is spoken about, but I see it happening a lot. And I even see like potentially a slight increase. And I think that it just has to do with cultural, societal changes. The brain is going to find something to latch onto. So lastly, I want to briefly introduce a specific manifestation of OCD, or not necessarily OCD, is kind of borderline in terms of whether or not you would categorize it as OCD, but it is what I call OCD-ED, so eating disorder induced OCD. This is a specific representation of obsessions and rituals that tend to happen to people with restrictive eating disorders. And these rituals don't necessarily have to do with calorie restriction or weight loss. A lot of times it could be completely random things, like needing to do things in a certain order or needing to do things in a certain numerical pattern. So for example, only being able to eat at a certain time, or not being able to have certain foods together, or certain foods needing to match each other in one way or another, or not having food touching. Or a presentation that I experienced myself during my own anorexia, which is actually surprisingly common, and that is number OCD in eating disorders. So for example, I had to do everything in even numbers, so 2, 4, 6, 8. So for example, I could only have 2 or 4 servings of peanut butter, but I couldn't have 3. And you may wonder, what is the difference between an eating disorder behavior and more like an OCD-ED behavior? And the answer is, there isn't a clear distinction here, but I do personally tend to see it more as OCD-ED rather than just purely restricted behavior, when the underlying motivation isn't necessarily to cut down calories or to lose weight. So for example, in the number OCD that I mentioned, I would rather have 4 tablespoons of peanut butter than 3, because 4 was a better number for me. It was a more correct number in some way. But that means more calories. So that's just how I personally make a distinction. But again, this is just my way of seeing it. This is not clear set science that everyone in the field agree on. But I have noticed that there are a lot of eating disorder behaviors that don't necessarily equate to weight loss or restriction per se. Sometimes it actually is more the opposite. And when it comes to OCD-ED, which by the way is not a diagnosis, it's not really a agreed upon thing, it is just more a term that I use to describe a set of rigid obsessions and compulsions that tend to happen to people with eating disorders. It is interestingly a behavior that tends to have a lot to do with the restriction and undernourishment we see in eating disorders. So I noticed that this behavior became a lot better, not just through actively challenging it, but also just through eating more and restoring weight. An undernourished brain is a rigid brain. We see this from several studies, for example, the Minnesota starvation study, which if you aren't familiar with, I would recommend the podcast episode I've done titled The Minnesota Starvation Study, where I talk about that study and why it's so important. Essentially, when you are restricting and when you are under your set point weight, when you are in that energetic deficit, something just shifts in the brain, especially when this restriction is prolonged and severe. It doesn't necessarily happen because someone missed breakfast one day. Even though, interestingly enough, in people with restrictive eating disorders, sometimes very small bits of restriction can set off a bit of a rigidity response. And that's just classical for OCD-ED. It's something that happens during the eating disorder and goes away with recovery. And this is different for other OCDs. So OCD in general absolutely can be made worse by restriction, even non-eating disorder types of OCD, but it won't necessarily always go away by recovery. I have seen several people who have an unrelated OCD, for example, around hand cleaning, who find that recovery and being recovered actually improves that OCD. But it is a little bit different because that behavior doesn't necessarily have to do with malnutrition, but malnutrition, because it creates more rigidity and inflexibility, can also make it worse. OCD and eating disorders have a huge overlap. So like I already spoke a bit about, it can be hard to know what is the OCD, what is my eating disorder, what is more OCD-ED, what is just the pure restrictive behaviors. Doesn't always matter that much. What matters is, how can you challenge it? How can you get better? How can you make productive changes towards freedom? What I find very interesting about OCD is that it tends to often co-occur with people with eating disorders, and there seems to be a genetic component. So for example, in genome studies, we see that people who have a genetic predisposition to an eating disorder, more specifically tend to be more anorexia, tend to also have a genetic predisposition towards OCD. So in families where there is a lot of anorexia, we often tend to see a lot of OCD. And if you, for example, are someone with anorexia, you may have a higher chance of having a child with OCD. So there seems to be a genetic component here. So when it comes to how many people with eating disorders also have OCD, the numbers are all over the place. So I think the lowest number I found was around like 10, 11%, and the highest number was something like 75. So what we can conclude is that there is a big overlap, but exactly how much overlap kind of varies. I would probably estimate it to be around like 1 in 3 to 50%, but that's just me making a rough estimate based on my experience working with people with eating disorders, and also just from generally looking at the literature, what I find to be the most common number that they agree on. And I think the reason why the numbers are so all over the place is that it depends on how you quantify OCD. Do you count OCD-ED? Or does it have to be a clinical diagnosis of OCD that is unrelated? Does it count just how someone score on like an OCD scale, or does it count on how many people have a previous diagnosis of it, right? So you can see that there's a good reason why the numbers are just all over the place. In terms of people with OCD, it's estimated around 10% have an eating disorder, some numbers being a bit higher than that as well. So what is it about OCD and eating disorders, especially anorexia, that overlap so much? I think the traits that predispose someone to OCD are also the same traits that predispose someone to eating disorders. Cognitive rigidity, inflexibility, neuroticism, life stressors, perfectionism. We tend to see these in both conditions. So some of these are more environmental, for example, experiencing stressful situations, but some of them are also more genetic. So certain personality traits are actually quite genetic. If both your parents score very high in neuroticism, there's a good chance that you will as well. And you can always discuss, is that due to the impact you experience from living in a household with two parents that are really neurotic, or is it a genetic trait? And we tend to see that it is a bit of both. We know this just from twin studies and from studies on people who've been adopted into different families. How much of the genetic personality traits do they keep? But that is just a little bit outside of the scope of this episode to discuss. But we can agree that personality is to some degree heritable. So is OCD personality then? No, it is not a personality. It just means that having a certain personality cluster tend to predispose people to certain mental health conditions. Essentially, someone who's just really, really chill are less likely to develop an eating disorder and less likely to develop OCD. But these things aren't always set in stone. I've seen a lot of people who've made actually quite drastic personality changes through recovery. Like, I genuinely feel like I have increased my set point mood. When I think about myself when I was in my teens, I was just quite low mood in general. Like, I was just not a very positive, upbeat person. And I'm not saying that I'm always the most positive person, but it's like my set point mood has actually gone up. I'm definitely chiller, I'll tell you that. But when it comes to OCD and personality, it is also important to mention that we also have a condition called obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. And this can be so confusing because the name is so similar to obsessive-compulsive disorder. I think they kind of flopped a bit when they named that, because that is just way too similar for two conditions that are actually, even though similarities occur, they are actually different. Obsessive-compulsive personality disorder is a personality disorder characterized by extreme rigidity, perfectionism, to a point where it's very hard to function. People with this personality disorder tend to have this extreme adherence to rules. They tend to be very, very rigid, often quite frugal, very tidy, very typical like overworkers, overachievers. And I know some of you are like, damn, that is me. And again, it's a personality disorder. You diagnose it as a personality disorder when these traits are extreme and when it causes significant impact in functioning across several arenas of your life. I mean, being quite a planner and liking things a certain way, I can raise my hand on that, but that doesn't mean you have a personality disorder. In the same way that a person being a bit more self-centered doesn't mean that they have narcissistic personality disorder, or someone being a bit more sensitive and have a tendency towards neuroticism doesn't immediately mean that they have borderline personality disorder. But this is a thing, and obsessive-compulsive personality disorder also is something that predisposes someone to eating disorders, especially anorexia nervosa. When it comes to bulimia nervosa and binge eating disorder, we tend to see a bit more correlation with borderline personality disorder, but I've observed a lot of borderline personality disorder in anorexia as well. So I would say borderline personality disorders, we tend to just see a lot of eating disorders in general in that specific personality disorder. But again, just like OCD becomes a mental health disorder when it is so extreme that it starts to just take over someone's life, obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, it's a personality disorder once you struggle to really just function. Or you may function, but there is impairment in that functioning when you look beyond the surface level. So for example, even though someone with obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, aka OCPD, may be performing really hard at work or in studies, they may find that they have such a hard time collaborating with other people and like doing some kind of teamwork or allocating a task to a colleague because they get so nitpicky that they may get fired from their job. So typically their colleagues may start to deliver complaints because they constantly feel picked at or judged or criticized. Or the person may do well at school, but they are spending so much time writing their essay and they can never get it finished, so they end up not delivering the essay and therefore struggling at school. Or they may just be constantly picking at their partner. Everything their partner is doing, it's never good enough. They can't be around people because they're constantly scanning themselves for saying something inappropriate. So in social situations, they may feel quite stiff and unnatural. And they constantly watch like a guard over what everyone else is saying. Did that person say something inappropriate? Is that person bad? And again, some of these traits are also traits we may see in something like autism or in other personality disorders or in social anxiety disorder or just personality, but again, this is just a cluster of behaviors that can be categorized as a personality disorder. This, of course, is a bit more rare, but I thought I'd mention it because, again, there is a bit of a link between eating disorders and this specific personality disorder, and there definitely is a link between eating disorders and this personality tendencies without it being a personality disorder. And I also think that this specific personality disorder is more represented in certain religious and political groups. This is not to say that being passionate about politics and religion and social justice is in any way bad or a personality disorder. Of course not. But it is that pattern of inability to cooperate, inflexibility, constantly nitpicking, and doing so across several arenas of life that is when it becomes quite problematic. A big difference between OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and obsessive-compulsive personality disorder is that OCD is what we call a ego-dystonic condition, whilst OCPD is ego-syntonic. Let me explain that. Ego dystonic means that it is something that goes against the person's values. The person knows they have a problem, they want to get better and stop it. So a person with OCD, they will typically be very distressed over the fact that they have OCD and often go to great lengths financially, personally, to get rid of their OCD. But with OCPD, which is ego syntonic, the person will typically don't think they have a problem. They'll typically just think that they are the ones who got it right. Their colleagues are just lazy. Nobody else gets it. The other people who are not as passionate about my religious or political cause, they are just immoral or misinformed or asleep. I get something that nobody else gets. I'm good, other people are bad. I do it right, other people do it wrong. So why would I change? Of course, there are some people with OCPD that do want to change and have more self-insight, but typically that's typically the difference. What we tend to say that when a condition is ego-syntonic, it goes with someone's ego and with someone's values, whilst when it's ego-dystonic, it goes against the value in ego. And this is interesting in the context of eating disorders, because eating disorders are often considered ego-syntonic. So it's considered that an eating disorder is part of a person's ego and that they don't want to change because they see it as a good thing. Especially this goes with anorexia nervosa. Think about how a lot of professionals talk about anorexia. They talk about it as someone who doesn't know they have a problem and doesn't want to change. And don't get me wrong, that absolutely does happen. But very often people with anorexia, they do know to some degree that they have a problem, even though they may be trying to rationalize and minimize it. And even though they often are very ambivalent, many do want to get better, and many kind of hate that they have an eating disorder. They often do want to change, at least part of them do, but they are very scared about all of the anxiety and the stress that occurs with recovery. And this is why I believe it's a bit more similar to OCD, because typically a person with OCD is not like, oh yeah, I just love having to constantly check whether I lock the door or not. Most of the times they hate that behavior, but they know that if they don't do the thing, it's going to create so much anxiety that it feels so much easier to just, I'm just going to do the thing. I know it's going to make me feel better. I'm going to sleep so much better if I just do the rituals. And this is the same with eating disorders, right? It's that it feels so tempting, like, if I just purge now after I binged, it's going to make me feel so much better. What's the problem, right? But here's the thing. Those sneaky little behaviors that you're engaging in is what keeps you stuck. And there's really no way to recover unless you beat those behaviors. And I think this is kind of good news to realize, because this also makes it easier to understand what the solution is. So imagine you're constantly obsessing about, should I walk in recovery? How much walking should I do? When should I do it? Maybe you're asking your treatment professionals, how much walking can I do? And they're like, 30 minutes is fine. But here's the thing. If that behavior is a ritual and a safety behavior, you can't just be like, I'm just not going to work on that. I'm just going to walk then. So let me just give another example to clarify a bit what I mean here in case that was a bit confusing. If I'm walking somewhere, me checking the map to see like, what am I going to pass on this walk is completely fine and harmless. But if I'm terrified that I'm going to walk past a school, for example, because I'm scared, what if I get an urge to harm children? Doing that behavior represents something very differently. So it's not about the behavior being good or bad on universal terms. It is about, is that behavior representing something else for you? For you, is that behavior a safety behavior? So for example, someone checking that they're not going to pass a school because they're scared, what if I get an urge to go and harm children there? In the same way, one person with an eating disorder may not have any issues with compulsive walking, and they may be in a physical space where walking is completely fine. For that person, going for an afternoon walk to clear their head when they're stressed can be a good thing, can be a recovery promoting thing. But for a person where walking is part of a compulsion, something that they're doing to deal with guilt around food, or a rule that they have to follow, that they have to walk 30 minutes a day, then it is suddenly not so innocent anymore. And I think once you make that reframe of not necessarily having to view your eating disorder as like a form of OCD, but at least viewing the urges and rituals as something to target in the same way that you would if you had OCD, can be very helpful. Go where there is anxiety and go where there is resistance. And I think this is something that a lot of traditional treatment get wrong. And please don't misunderstand me here. I am by no means suggesting that if your treatment system gets this wrong, that it is not worth going to treatment. I know that sounds really obvious, probably to most of you, but I've seen a bit of a tendency sometimes in recovery spaces where there's a suggestion that if your treatment system doesn't completely get it, then it is better just not to do any kind of treatment. And don't get me wrong, there are some people who do better just doing recovery on their own in their own way. That's completely fine if it works for you and if you can do that safely. But I've just seen one too many cases of people who just end up just doing nothing and being quite unsafe. But still, I have to point out pitfalls where I believe it is due. And one thing I often see in traditional treatment is that there will be a cookie cutter approach where it will be, for example, you can walk 30 minutes a day, bam, without investigating what does that behavior mean for that person. Because one person's safety behavior is another person's fear behavior. For one person, drinking nutritional drinks could be a massive recovery win, fear food challenge, you name it, whilst for another people, those drinks are a safe food. So I think it's so important, especially when you get out of that more acute, just stabilizing phase where you kind of can't think that much about fear food challenges. When you get into that more like active recovery state, it is so important to be very individualized and think, what are my fears? What are my safety behaviors? And then challenge accordingly, rather than just following a list of this is what people with eating disorders are scared of. This is what you can and can't do in treatment, because that should be slightly adjusted and made individualized. At least that is how I operate with clients. You wouldn't believe how many times I will have two clients right after each other where one person talks about a safety behavior, a comfort behavior, and then the next client talk about that behavior being a massive fear. So go where the fear is and challenge that fear consistently. Some people prefer to do those challenges gradually. Other people prefer to more just go for it. There is no wrong or right way as long as it takes you forward. I've spoken a bit about this in my episode on All In, where I talk about the pros and cons, the good, the bad, the ugly of All In. So that may be helpful for someone who are unsure about how to actually start challenging things. Like, should I just go for it? Or do I do a bit more planned and steady and kind of, schedule it out in some ways? Different strokes for different folks. As long as you're doing some form of exposure therapy and some kind of response prevention. And ideally doing that with a professional that is aware of this and can help you target. And someone who sees you and your unique situation rather than just being like, bam, eating disorder, you think and feel this way, end of story. Because yes, there are a lot of similarities. Eating disorders aren't that creative, I'll tell you that. But the behaviors, even though they often have an underlying driver, can sometimes be a little bit different from person to person. So speaking of behaviors, what are some other examples of sneaky kind of OCD-ED-like behaviors that may not be directly related to weight loss or wanting to eat less calories, but still co-occur? Some of these behaviors, some people may argue, fall under the OCD-ED category, others not, but I still want to mention some of these behaviors because I see them a lot and I just want to kind of, just bring them to light because I feel like some of these aren't spoken about as often as I believe they should be. So one of those behaviors that I see over and over and over and over again is some form of rumination. And that rumination translating into research behaviors. For example, someone being really obsessed about their gut health. And don't get me wrong, gut health is important, but typically these people will be obsessed with finding evidence as to why they should keep engaging in restrictive behaviors and cutting out food, rather than solving the underlying issue, which is an energy-deprived digestive system, an excessive amount of stress, dysregulated nervous system, creating digestive issues. But instead, they will spend hours and hours and hours researching what foods are good for their gut, what can they cut out. Some of these people may be down to eating only a few foods, and unfortunately, some professionals, typically more neuropaths, tend to prey on these people. Again, not saying all neuropaths do that, but I'm saying that I've seen a lot of people going and getting a list of several pages of foods that they can't eat. And their eating disorder clearly has not been considered. The fact that they have a energy-suppressed digestive system haven't been considered. The fact that they have a lot of anxiety hasn't been considered. So people with this kind of obsessive-compulsive focus around digestion may constantly be monitoring how many bowel movements they're having. They may be like pressing their stomach to see if they can feel something, constantly checking how bloated they are, constantly eating depending on their bowel functions, constantly looking for more foods to add, or no, not really add, take away would be more the common one here. Excessively spending on supplements, excessively spending on medical appointments, but just not getting anywhere, they're just getting worse. Researching. They know everything. They can memorize every low FODMAP food in their heads. And they're just so hypervigilant to any kind of internal cues because there is heightened anxiety. They feel things. So for example, most people may not feel that they were a little bit bloated that day, but this person will obsessively monitor it. And they may misuse certain medications as a result. And that's just the number one focus. If they haven't, for example, had a bowel movement, they have a bad day, right? This is not normal. This is not being health conscious. This is not healthy. I'm just saying that because I've seen a lot of people not realizing that spending 90% of your time thinking about your digestion is actually not normal. Again, I understand there's complexities here. I understand there are people with certain chronic health conditions, but I'm more talking about a specific type of obsessive compulsive manifestation here. Also, this behavior can co-occur with chronic health conditions, and it often does for very understandable reasons. I would probably classify some of this under health anxiety. Health anxiety can in some ways be seen as a form of OCD because the person will typically ruminate and engage in a lot of compulsions around researching and self-monitoring their bodies. So that's one that I wanted to mention because I feel like that one is not mentioned enough. So other more sneaky food behaviors could be around obsession around food being contaminated or expired. I had elements of this. I was scared of my food being poisoned. I was scared of the waiter giving me regular soda instead of Diet Coke. And this can also overlap a bit with emetophobia, so the fear of throwing up, the fear of eating something that will upset your stomach. And that can also be something where we have that excessive self-monitoring and rumination, for example, researching what foods are more likely to get me food poisoned, constantly trying to see, am I nauseous, am I nauseous, am I nauseous? Which of course then makes you more nauseous, and it's a self-fulfilling cycle. Another one that deserves a bit of an honorable mention is moral scrupulosity around eating the perfect diet in terms of ethics. Oof, this is a tricky one, right? Because it can be hard to tell. Like, is this just something that is really important for me as a person to eat this way? Or is this my eating disorder? Or is this a productive thing that helps me in life? Or is it not? Ooh, is this it? Because heightened moral concern is definitely something that I often see in people with eating disorders. But what's interesting is that sometimes it's more around food than other things. Even though I will also say that a lot of times it is around depriving yourself as much as humanly possible. So typically they may live a really simple life, right? They may not buy themselves new things, but they will buy other people things. And I think that is a big red flag, is when you treat other people better than you would treat yourself. So you have no issue buying your friend some fast fashion, but then with yourself, oh, absolutely not. Again, I understand this is a bit of a sensitive one because I'm not saying that there aren't problems in the food industry or there aren't problems in the fashion industry, etc., etc. But typically, when it becomes more like a moral scrupulosity thing is when someone is just obsessing over it, and it limits them, it limits their social functioning. They spend hours every day planning out their food, researching what is the most ethical, sustainable way of eating. They're terrified of accident eating something that isn't fair trade or vegan or whatsoever. And this can also manifest as more like budget, where someone is just obsessed with keeping a food budget and the food budget needing to be as low as possible. But if their friend asks them, oh, hey, can you buy me a muffin? No problem. But again, it's about depriving themselves, not necessarily other people, even though some people may push these behaviors on others as well. I've actually written an article about this over at letsrecover.substack.com called Ethical Orthorexia, Veganism, and Moral Rigidity in Eating Disorders. And this can also manifest as orthorexia, I would say. Again, all of these things kind of overlap in many ways. So this may be a person who's just terrified of eating the wrong thing and quote unquote becoming unhealthy. That may be the core fear. And as a result, they're engaging in all sorts of safety behaviors that they believe will prevent them from dying an early death. But of course, the problem is these behaviors just make them more unhealthy, actually. That's the paradox of it. Same thing, they may be ruminating endlessly about what they ate, endlessly researching. They may be looking up evidence as to why they are right. So they may spend a lot of time in certain niche diet communities to kind of get that confirmation bias. Or they may watch documentaries like My 600-Pound Life, thinking that if I don't do all of these rituals and behaviors, that's going to be me. So they're constantly trying to almost reinforce their fears. Another little obsessive ritual that I sometimes see in people with eating disorders is body checking. So essentially trying to control your body through just repeatedly checking it. So it's a bit like the person trying to control whether or not someone's breaking in by just checking if they lock the door over and over and over. So in the same way, people with eating disorders may just think that if I just keep checking my body, I can prevent it from going out of control. I can stop it before it goes out of control. Honestly, I could probably have gone on and on and on about this because there are so many obsessions leading to compulsions in eating disorders without it necessarily being OCD. And I want to make that clear. If you are struggling with some of these behaviors I just mentioned, it doesn't necessarily mean you have OCD. But I think if we look at more obsessive compulsive thoughts and urges and behaviors as an umbrella, we can see that some of it would fall somewhere under it. Doesn't necessarily make it OCD, doesn't necessarily make it OCD-ED, doesn't necessarily make it obsessive-compulsive personality disorder either, but it can be. So it is often said that if you have OCD and an eating disorder, that can complicate recovery. But I actually have to say that that is not necessarily in alignment with what I have seen in clients. I often find that clients, once they become aware and kind of understand their eating disorder as a bunch of obsessions and compulsions that they have to challenge and get rid of through exposure and response prevention, they often tend to do really, really well. The biggest challenge is often accepting that you are going to have to be uncomfortable sometimes. You're going to have to feel a bit of anxiety sometimes. But one thing I would encourage people to be a bit aware of is that it is often rumination that leads to anxiety. And you can't always control your thoughts, but you can control whether or not you engage in rumination. In the same way that if I ask you to solve a math equation and then I ask you to stop it, you can choose to start and stop that. And that's good news, and that's relieving to hear that you're not completely powerless to your thoughts. When it comes to rumination, rumination is something you're doing. It's not something that just happens to you. So it is something where if you become aware in the moment, you can learn to stop. But your thoughts and feelings, they may float a bit by, and that's okay. Think about them as clouds on the sky, right? You see them floating by, you let them pass, but they aren't the sky. The sky have them. And I understand this is difficult, and this is a skill that people often have to work on and learn, sometimes in coaching and therapy. I would especially recommend something like acceptance and commitment therapy for this, or something like exposure and response prevention therapy, especially if you have obsessive-compulsive disorder. But the good news and the key takeaway from this episode is that recovery, whether it is from OCD or an eating disorder or both, is very much a possibility. These are conditions that can respond very well to treatment, especially OCD perhaps, because people with OCD tend to be a bit more motivated to recover than people with eating disorders. Because again, it goes back to what I spoke about with things being ego dystonic or ego syntonic. People with eating disorders may have some difficulty with recovery because they want to hold on to their eating disorder. They feel like they get something out of it in terms of their identity and purpose. Whilst people with OCD, they tend to often get less out of it. I would say though that once you're fully recovered from an eating disorder, you would realize just how little you actually did get out of it. But in the moment, as part of the illness, it may feel like, oh yeah, this is great, right? So I want to say that just hopefully to offer up some hope that recovery absolutely is possible, and both of these conditions can respond very well to the correct form of support and treatment approach. That approach may be a little bit different for each person, but in general, it requires not doing the safety behaviors. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, feel free to leave a rating or share with a friend. So you can find me at my website, letsrecover.co.uk, where I offer one-on-one coaching and I also offer group coaching. I hope to have another round of group coaching starting later this year, 2025. So if you're interested in group coaching, please do sign up on my website to get notified when I have spaces available. You don't have to join just because you signed up to get notified. It is no strings attached, but it just kind of helps me see how many people are interested. Because of course, if there's a lot of interest very soon, then I might do it a bit sooner. All right, guys, I hope you have a lovely start of the year, and I will see you guys in the next episode.